In the sterile halls of military physical therapy centers across the nation, thousands of wounded veterans shuffle through their daily rehabilitation routines. Most are treated with the respect their service deserves. But sometimes prejudice wears a uniform too. What happens when a decorated war hero's identity is hidden beneath civilian clothes, and the very people meant to heal become the ones who wound? This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, whose journey through a routine PT session would expose the ugly truth about how we sometimes treat those who've sacrificed everything for our freedom. It's a tale that begins with dismissal and ends with a revelation that would shake an entire medical facility to its core. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't found on a battlefield. It's found in the courage to stand up and reveal who you really are. The automatic doors of the Regional Military Medical Center whooshed open, letting in the crisp autumn air along with Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone whose body had been through hell and was still finding its way back. Her civilian clothes, faded jeans, and a simple gray sweater gave no hint of the distinguished military career that had brought her to this moment. Sarah had specifically chosen to dress down today. After months of being saluted, having doors held open, and receiving the deferential treatment that came with her rank, she wanted to experience her physical therapy sessions as just another patient. She needed to know if the care provided here was genuinely good, or if it was simply polished to shine brighter in the presence of high-ranking officers. The lobby buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run medical facility. Veterans of all ages sat in cushioned chairs, some reading magazines, others staring off in a space with that distant look that came from carrying invisible wounds. Sarah had seen that expression in mirrors more times than she cared to count. She approached the reception desk, where a young woman with bright pink nail polish was typing with practiced speed. Her name tag read Jessica in cheerful blue letters. "I'm here for my 2 o'clock appointment with physical therapy," Sarah said, sliding her appointment card across the counter. Jessica glanced up briefly, her eyes taking in Sarah's unremarkable appearance. The practiced smile never wavered, but something subtle shifted in her demeanor. "Name?" "Sarah Chun." Jessica's fingers clicked across her keyboard with mechanical precision. "I see you here. First time with us?" "Yes. You need to fill out these forms." Jessica slid a thick packet of paperwork across the counter without making eye contact. "The waiting area for PT is down that hall. Second door on your right. They'll call you when they're ready." Sarah gathered the forms and made her way to the designated waiting area. The hallway was lined with photographs of smiling service members, their faces bright with the optimism of youth and purpose. She wondered how many of them had ended up in places like this, fighting different battles than the ones they trained for. The PT waiting room was smaller than the main lobby, with hard plastic chairs arranged in neat rows. About a dozen people sat scattered throughout, most absorbed in their phones or the muted television mounted in the corner. Sarah found a seat near the window and began working through the forms. The paperwork was exhaustive: medical history, current medications, pain scales, functional assessments. As she filled in her background, Sarah's mind drifted to the events that had brought her here. The explosion had come without warning during what was supposed to be a routine convoy inspection in Afghanistan. One moment she was discussing supply routes with her logistics team. The next she was waking up in a field hospital with a body that no longer moved the way she remembered. The shrapnel had been removed, the bones had healed, but the soft tissue damage to her left shoulder and hip had left her with a complex web of scar tissue and nerve damage that made simple movements feel like navigating a minefield. Every physical therapist she'd seen had emphasized that recovery would be slow, that progress would be measured in millimeters rather than miles. "Next," called a voice from the therapy area. Sarah looked up to see a tall, thin man in navy blue scrubs scanning the waiting room. His name tag identified him as Derek, physical therapist. His eyes passed over her completely, landing instead on an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap. "Mr. Rodriguez." Derek's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been present in his general announcement. The elderly veteran struggled to his feet, and Derek immediately moved to assist him, offering his arm for support. Sarah watched as Derek guided Mr. Rodriguez through the doorway, their conversation peppered with respectful Sir S. and genuine concern for the man's comfort. 20 minutes later, Derek returned to collect his next patient. Again, his eyes swept past Sarah, this time settling on a middle-aged man wearing a military-style haircut and a t-shirt that read Army Strong. The pattern continued for the next hour. Sarah watched as Derek and his colleagues, a woman named Rita and a younger man called Kevin, collected patient after patient. Veterans with visible signs of their military service were greeted with smiles, offered assistance, and treated with obvious respect. But when Derek's eyes passed over Sarah, they held the same disinterested glance she might expect from someone looking through her rather than at her. Finally, Derek approached her section of the waiting room. Only 3 people remained: Sarah, an elderly woman knitting in the corner, and a nervous-looking young man picking at his fingernails. "Chun," Derek called out, his voice flat and professional. Sarah stood, gathering her completed paperwork. "That's me." Derek's expression didn't change as he looked her up and down. No smile, no offer of assistance, no warmth in his voice. "Follow me." The therapy room was vast and bright, filled with exercise equipment that looked more like medieval torture devices than healing tools. Parallel bars stretched along one wall, while various weight machines and exercise balls were scattered throughout the space. The air smelled of antiseptic and determination. Derek led her to a small desk area separated from the main floor by a low partition. He took the paperwork she offered and began flipping through it with the enthusiasm of someone reviewing tax forms. "Says here you're dealing with shoulder and hip issues from an IED blast," he said without looking up. "When did this happen?" 14 months ago. Derek's eyes remained on the forms. "And you've had previous therapy?" "Yes, at Walter Reed initially, then at the base clinic." Derek's eyebrows raised slightly. "Base clinic? You active duty?" Sarah had debated how to answer this question. Technically, she was on extended medical leave, which meant she was still active duty, but not currently serving in an operational capacity. She could feel the weight of the moment. This was where she would either reveal her rank and watch Derek's demeanor change, or continue with her experiment in anonymous care. "I'm on medical leave," she said carefully. Derek nodded absently and continued reading. "It says here you're experiencing ongoing pain and limited range of motion. Scale of 1 to 10. Where's your pain right now?" "About a 4 in the shoulder, 6 in the hip." "And what kind of work do you do? I need to know what functional goals we're working toward." Again, the moment of truth. Sarah had prepared for this question too. "I work in logistics and planning." It wasn't technically a lie. Commanding a logistics battalion certainly involved logistics and planning, but it was vague enough to avoid revealing her true position. Derek finally looked up at her, and Sarah could see him making quick assessments. Young woman, maybe early 30s, unremarkable clothes, no obvious military bearing in her posture or speech. His expression suggested he was mentally filing her under civilian contractor or perhaps dependent spouse. "Okay, let's start with some basic assessments," Derek said, standing up. "I need to see what your current range of motion looks like." What followed was 45 minutes of the most perfunctory physical therapy session Sarah had ever experienced. Derek guided her through a series of movements and stretches with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions. He offered no encouragement when she struggled, no advice for managing pain, no explanation of what they were trying to accomplish. When Sarah winced as Derek pushed her arm through a particularly difficult stretch, he simply noted it on his clipboard without comment. When she asked about exercises she could do at home, he handed her a generic photocopied sheet that looked like it had been run through the machine 1,000 times. The contrast with what she'd observed earlier was stark. She'd watched Derek spend extra time explaining exercises to Mr. Rodriguez, had seen him adjust the difficulty when the Vietnam veteran struggled. Kevin, the younger therapist, had been demonstrating proper form to the Army veteran, taking time to ensure the man understood not just what to do, but why he was doing it. But with Sarah, Derek seemed to be watching the clock, moving through his checklist with the efficiency of someone eager to finish and move on to the next appointment. "That's about all we can accomplish today," Derek announced as they reached the 45-minute mark. "Rita will schedule your next appointment." Sarah gathered her things, feeling a familiar ache in her hip that had nothing to do with the exercises. As she walked toward the scheduling desk, she passed Kevin working with a young man who was clearly struggling with his rehabilitation. The patient wore a prosthetic leg, and Kevin was patiently encouraging him through a series of balance exercises. "You're doing great, Sergeant," Kevin was saying. "I know this is frustrating, but you're making real progress. Remember what we talked about. This is a marathon, not a sprint." The patient nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's just hard some days, you know. I keep thinking about how easy this used to be." "That's completely normal," Kevin replied, his voice full of genuine empathy. "Every person I've worked with has felt exactly the same way. But look how much stronger you've gotten since we started. Your balance is improving. Your confidence is building. You're getting your life back, step by step." Sarah paused, pretending to look at one of the motivational posters on the wall while she listened. This was the kind of therapy she remembered from her early days at Walter Reed. Compassionate, personalized, focused on the whole person rather than just the injury. Rita looked up as Sarah approached the scheduling desk. Like Derek, her initial smile faded slightly as she took in Sarah's unremarkable appearance. "How did everything go today?" Rita asked, though her tone suggested the question was more ritual than genuine interest. "Fine," Sarah replied simply. "Derek wants to see you twice a week for the next month. Then we'll reassess. I have openings Tuesday and Thursday at 2, or Monday and Wednesday at 4. Sarah chose the Tuesday/Thursday option and accepted the appointment cards Rita printed for her. As she walked back toward the main lobby, she could hear Derek's voice behind her, greeting his next patient, a man in camouflage pants and combat boots. "Afternoon, Chief." Derek's voice carried the same warmth she'd heard him use with other obvious veterans. "Good to see you again. How's that knee feeling today?" The difference was unmistakable. As Sarah pushed through the automatic doors and walked toward her car, she found herself thinking about the young Sergeant Kevin had been encouraging. That young man was receiving exactly the kind of care every veteran deserved: patient, knowledgeable, and deeply respectful of the sacrifice that had brought him to that rehabilitation table. But what about the veterans who didn't look the part? What about the women who chose not to wear their service on their sleeves? What about anyone who didn't fit Derek's apparent mental image of what a veteran should look like? Sarah sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, watching other patients come and go through the medical center's doors. Some wore military-style clothing or veteran-branded gear, while others, like herself, had chosen civilian attire. She wondered how many of the latter group were receiving the same indifferent treatment she'd experienced. Her phone buzzed with a text from her aide-de-camp, Major Williams. "Colonel, how did the PT session go? Do you need me to arrange anything for tomorrow's briefing?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. The respectful colonel, the immediate offer of assistance, the assumption that her time was valuable and her comfort mattered. It was everything her therapy session hadn't been. She typed back, "Session was informative. No changes needed for tomorrow." As she drove home, Sarah found herself thinking about the snake tattoo hidden beneath her sweater. The small, coiled serpent on her left shoulder blade had been a graduation gift to herself after completing Ranger School, one of only a handful of women to do so at the time. It was a symbol of resilience, of refusing to be broken no matter how much pressure was applied. The tattoo had become something of a legend among her troops. During particularly difficult training exercises or stressful deployments, soldiers would joke about awakening the snake, their way of saying their commander was about to show just how tough she could be when the situation demanded it. Sarah had kept that part of herself carefully hidden during today's appointment. She'd wanted to see how she would be treated as just another patient, without rank or reputation to smooth her path. The experiment had been successful, though not in the way she'd hoped. She made a mental note to return for her next appointment exactly as she had today. Civilian clothes, no military bearing, no hint of her true identity. She needed to understand if what she'd experienced was an anomaly or a pattern. If it was the latter, then this facility had a serious problem that needed addressing. But first, she had other responsibilities to attend to. Tomorrow's briefing was with the base commander about improving support services for returning veterans. Sarah smiled grimly as she realized she now had first-hand research to contribute to that discussion. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and the careful dance of military bureaucracy. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to conversations about veteran care, listening for subtle signs that others might have experienced what she had. She discovered that several of her junior officers had sought care at civilian facilities rather than military ones, citing more convenient locations or better scheduling. She wondered if convenience was really the driving factor. Tuesday arrived faster than Sarah had expected. She dressed carefully in the same unremarkable civilian clothes, making sure to cover the snake tattoo that had become an unexpected symbol of her hidden identity. This time, she was prepared for what she might encounter, but she hoped her first experience had been an outlier. The waiting room held a different collection of people, but the dynamics were eerily similar. Derek emerged from the therapy area and called out names with the same selective warmth she'd observed before. Veterans who looked the part received smiles and assistance. Those who didn't were treated with professional indifference. When Derek finally called her name, Sarah noticed he didn't even bother to look up from his clipboard. She followed him to the same desk area, where he pulled up her file with the enthusiasm of someone reviewing yesterday's grocery list. "How's the pain been since last time?" he asked, still not making eye contact. "About the same. The hip's been a bit stiff in the mornings." Derek nodded and made a note. "We'll work on some mobility exercises today. Let's see how you're progressing with the range of motion." The session unfolded much like the first one. Mechanical, impersonal, focused more on checking boxes than on actual healing. Derek guided her through exercises without explaining their purpose, offered no modifications when she struggled, and seemed genuinely annoyed when she asked questions about proper form. But this time, Sarah was paying closer attention to the environment around her. She watched how Rita interacted with different patients at the scheduling desk, noting the subtle but distinct difference in treatment. She observed Kevin's sessions with various clients, seeing how his level of engagement varied based on apparent military status. Most telling was what happened when Derek's next patient arrived early. Through the low partition, Sarah could see a man in his 50s wearing a navy ball cap and a shirt with USS Enterprise emblazoned across the chest. Derek's entire demeanor shifted the moment he spotted the man. "Chief Petty Officer Morrison." Derek called out warmly, even though they were in the middle of Sarah's session. "You're early today. How's that back treating you?" Derek actually paused Sarah's exercise to walk over and shake the man's hand, leaving her standing awkwardly by the parallel bars while he engaged in several minutes of animated conversation about the man's service aboard the aircraft carrier. When Derek returned to finish Sarah's session, he seemed distracted and eager to wrap up. The remaining exercises were rushed, and he provided even less explanation than usual. Sarah left feeling like she'd been an interruption in Derek's day rather than his scheduled patient. As she walked toward the parking lot, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister's number. "Hey, Lisa," Sarah answered. "Sarah, how's the therapy going? Are you feeling stronger?" Sarah paused beside her car, considering how to answer. Lisa was a nurse at a civilian hospital in California, and she'd been encouraging Sarah to seek the best possible care for her injuries. Her sister had no patience for substandard medical treatment, regardless of where it came from. "It's adequate," Sarah said carefully. "Adequate? That doesn't sound like you. You usually demand excellence from everything. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Sarah, you're a decorated military officer with complex injuries that need specialized care. You shouldn't be settling for adequate." Sarah found herself smiling despite her frustration. Lisa had always been her fiercest advocate, The person who pushed her to demand better when she was inclined to just endure whatever was offered. I'm conducting a kind of experiment, Sarah explained. Seeing what the care is like when they don't know who I am. There was a long pause. And it's eye-opening. Not in a good way, I'm guessing. No, not in a good way. Lisa's voice took on a sharp edge that Sarah recognized from her sister's descriptions of fighting hospital bureaucracy. Sarah, you don't owe anyone a social experiment. You need proper care, and you have every right to use your rank and position to get it. But what about the people who don't have rank and position? What about the veterans who look like me instead of like the poster on the wall? Lisa sighed. You're going to fix this, aren't you? Probably. Good. Because if you don't, I'm going to drive out there and fix it myself. And you know I'm nowhere near as diplomatic as you are. Sarah laughed for the first time in days. Lisa had once gotten 3 doctors fired and an entire nursing staff retrained after witnessing substandard care in her own hospital's emergency department. Diplomacy was not her sister's strong suit. I'll handle it, Sarah promised. But I need to understand the full scope of the problem first. Just don't let them damage you further while you're gathering your evidence. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car for a few minutes, thinking about Lisa's words. Her sister was right. She did have every right to reveal her identity and demand the level of care her rank and service record warranted. But doing so would only solve the problem for her. The other veterans who didn't fit Derek's narrow definition of what a service member should look like would continue to receive indifferent treatment. Sarah had made a decision. She would continue her anonymous visits, but she would also begin documenting everything she observed. If she was going to address this problem, and she was increasingly certain that she needed more than just her personal experience to support her case. She pulled out her phone and opened a new note. PT session number 2, she typed. Patient ignored while therapist engaged with obvious veteran. Exercises rushed and poorly explained. No encouragement or personalized attention. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time she finished this course of treatment, she would have a comprehensive record of everything she'd witnessed. And then, Sarah thought with a slight smile, Derek and his colleagues are going to meet the snake. The third appointment arrived with an unexpected complication. Sarah had been prepared for another session of mechanical indifference, but as she sat in the waiting room, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 young veterans sat nearby, both appearing to be in their early 20s. The woman wore civilian clothes similar to Sarah's own, jeans, sneakers, and a plain t-shirt. Her companion was a man whose military bearing was unmistakable despite his casual attire. I'm telling you, Jess, you should try the VA hospital across town, the man was saying quietly. The care here isn't the same unless you look the part. The woman, Jess, shook her head. My doctor referred me here specifically. She said they have the best equipment for my type of injury. Equipment doesn't matter if the therapist doesn't care enough to use it properly. Sarah strained to hear more without appearing obvious. The man continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Look, I've been to both places. Well, I come here wearing my Army shirt and veteran's cap. They treat me like gold. But my girlfriend came here last month for her back injury. She's Air Force, by the way, and they treated her like she was wasting their time. Same injury I had, same exercises, but completely different attitude. Jess glanced around nervously. But I already have the appointment scheduled. Just watch how they interact with other patients. You'll see what I mean. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't just her experience. It was a pattern that other veterans had noticed and were actively discussing. How many others had chosen to seek care elsewhere rather than fight for proper treatment? When Derek called Jess's name, Sarah watched carefully. Just as she'd predicted, his demeanor was polite but detached. No warmth, no offer of assistance, no acknowledgement of her service, even though her medical intake forms would have clearly indicated her veteran status. The man, meanwhile, was greeted by Kevin with obvious respect and enthusiasm. Sergeant Martinez, good to see you again. How's that shoulder feeling? The differential treatment was so stark that Sarah wondered how the staff didn't notice it themselves. But then again, unconscious bias was called unconscious for a reason. Sarah's own session followed the now familiar pattern, but this time she made a point of asking more probing questions. "Derek, I'm not seeing much improvement in my range of motion," she said during a particularly difficult shoulder exercise. "Is there something different we should be trying?" Derek barely looked up from his notes. "These things take time. Just keep doing the exercises." But my previous therapist at the base clinic mentioned that there might be some advanced techniques for dealing with nerve damage complications. "Have you had training in those approaches?" For the first time, Derek seemed slightly flustered. "The base clinic? I thought you said you worked in logistics." Sarah had to be careful here. "Duh. But I was treated at the base clinic initially because of how the injury occurred." Derek's confusion was evident, but he didn't pursue the question further. Instead, he seemed to dismiss her concerns entirely. "We use evidence-based practices here. If you're not seeing progress, it's probably because you need to be more consistent with your home exercises." The implied criticism stung. Sarah had been religious about her home exercise routine, pushing through pain levels that would have sent most people to the emergency room. To suggest that her lack of progress was due to personal laziness felt like a slap in the face. But more importantly, it revealed something troubling about Derek's approach. Rather than considering whether his treatment plan might need adjustment, his first instinct was to blame the patient. Sarah wondered how many veterans had been told their persistent pain was their own fault. After the session, Sarah lingered in the lobby, pretending to check her phone while observing the interaction between Derek and his next patient, an older man wearing a Marines t-shirt and veteran baseball cap. "Semper fi Marina." Derek greeted him with a broad smile. "How's that knee treating you today?" The man grimaced slightly. "Still giving me trouble, especially in the mornings." "Let's take a look at adjusting your exercise routine," Derek said immediately. "Sometimes we need to try different approaches to find what works best for each individual." Sarah felt her jaw clench. The same concerns she'd raised about lack of progress had been dismissed as patient noncompliance. But when expressed by someone who looked like Derek's mental image of a veteran, it was met with immediate attention and care. She drove home in a simmering rage that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with injustice. That evening, she found herself pacing her apartment, unable to settle into her usual routine of reading or watching television. Her phone rang, interrupting her angry circuit around the living room. The caller ID showed Major Williams. "Good evening, Colonel. I hope I'm not calling too late." Sarah glanced at her watch. It was barely 7 p.m. "Not at all, Major. What's on your mind?" "I've been reviewing the agenda for next week's Veteran Services Committee meeting, and I wanted to run a few items past you. We're discussing the new partnership with civilian medical facilities, and I thought you might have some insights given your recent experiences." Sarah paused. Major Williams was one of the most perceptive officers she'd ever worked with. Had he somehow picked up on her ongoing experiment? "What kind of insights are you looking for?" "Well, there's been some informal feedback suggesting that the level of care at partner facilities may vary depending on various factors. I was hoping you might have observed anything relevant during your recent medical appointments." There was diplomatic military speak, for I know something's bothering you, and it's related to your health care. Sarah made a decision. "Actually, Major, I think we need to schedule a separate meeting to discuss this topic in detail. There are some issues that need immediate attention." "Of course, Colonel. Tomorrow at 0900. Make it 0800. And ask Captain Rodriguez from the Inspector General's office to join us." There was a brief pause. Major Williams was too professional to ask why she wanted IG involvement, but Sarah could hear his mental gears turning. "Understood, Mom. Anything else you need me to prepare? Just bring your notebook. We're going to have a lot to document." After ending the call, Sarah felt some of her anger transform into something more productive, determination. She'd spent her career fixing broken systems and holding people accountable for substandard performance. This situation was no different, except that the stakes were higher. Poor logistics could delay a mission. Poor medical care could permanently damage the people who'd already sacrificed so much. She opened her laptop and began typing a detailed report of everything she'd observed over her 3 appointments. Names, dates, specific interactions, direct quotes where she could remember them. If she was going to bring this to the attention of her chain of command, she needed to present facts, not emotions. The next morning's meeting proved to be as significant as Sarah had anticipated. Major Williams arrived precisely at 0800, followed by Captain Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed young officer whose reputation for thorough investigations preceded her. "Good morning, Colonel," Captain Rodriguez said as she settled into her chair. "Major Williams mentioned you have some concerns about veteran healthcare services." Sarah had spent the night preparing for this conversation, but she still felt a moment of hesitation. Once she started down this path, there would be no turning back. Derek and his colleagues were about to have their professional lives scrutinized in ways they couldn't imagine. "Captain, I need to brief you on a pattern of discriminatory treatment I've personally observed at the Regional Military Medical Center." Sarah slid copies of her detailed notes across the table. "Over the past week, I've witnessed systematic differences in the quality of care provided based on patients' apparent military status and presentation." Captain Rodriguez began reading immediately, her expression growing more serious with each page. Major Williams leaned forward, his face reflecting both concern and understanding. Clearly, he'd suspected something was amiss. "Colonel, these are serious allegations," Captain Rodriguez said when she finished reading. "You're describing what amounts to discriminatory medical care based on stereotypical assumptions about veteran appearance." "That's correct. And I believe this is happening because I've been receiving care while dressed in civilian clothing without identifying my rank or position. The staff has made assumptions about my veteran status based purely on my appearance." Major Williams spoke up. "Ma'am, with respect, why didn't you simply identify yourself? Surely that would have resolved any misunderstanding." Sarah had anticipated this question. "Because, Major, the problem isn't that I'm not receiving appropriate care. The problem is that other veterans who don't fit a certain visual profile are being systematically undertreated. Solving it for me personally doesn't address the larger issue." Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "The Colonel is correct. If there's discriminatory treatment occurring, we need to understand its full scope, not just resolve individual cases." They spent the next hour going through Sarah's observations in detail. Captain Rodriguez asked probing questions about specific incidents, requested clarification on timeframes, and made extensive notes about potential witnesses. "Colonel, I'm going to need to conduct a formal investigation," Captain Rodriguez concluded. "This will require interviews with staff, review of treatment protocols, and analysis of patient satisfaction data. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Sarah nodded. "I am. But I want to make something clear. My goal isn't to destroy careers or shut down the facility. My goal is to ensure that every veteran receives the same level of care regardless of how they look or dress." "Understood. However, if we find evidence of systematic discrimination, there will need to be consequences. Good intentions don't excuse poor outcomes." Major Williams cleared his throat. "Colonel, there's one more thing to consider. You'll need to decide whether to continue your treatment there during the investigation, and, if so, whether to maintain your current anonymity." Sarah had been wrestling with this question since making the decision to report the issue. Continuing her charade felt increasingly dishonest, but revealing her identity might compromise the investigation. "I think I need to attend one more session," she said finally. "But this time, I'm going to document everything more systematically. With your permission, Captain Rodriguez, I'd like to wear a recording device." "That's—" Captain Rodriguez paused, considering the legal implications. "That's permissible under military investigation protocols, but we'll need to ensure we follow proper procedures. I'll have the recording equipment and legal authorization prepared." As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She'd set something in motion that would likely have far-reaching consequences, but it was the right thing to do. Too many veterans had already suffered through substandard care, because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what a service member should look like. The rest of the day was consumed with routine administrative tasks, but Sarah found her mind constantly returning to the upcoming appointment. Tomorrow would be her fourth session, and if everything went according to plan, it would also be Derek's last chance to demonstrate whether his treatment patterns were unconscious bias or deliberate discrimination. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, looking at the reflection of someone who'd spent her entire adult life in service to her country. Tomorrow, she would walk into that facility one more time as an anonymous patient, but it would be the last time. After tomorrow, Derek and his colleagues would learn exactly who they'd been dismissing. She turned to examine the small snake tattoo on her shoulder blade in the mirror. Tomorrow, Sarah thought with grim satisfaction, they were going to meet the snake face to face. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "How's the therapy experiment going?" Sarah typed back, "Coming to an end soon. I think you'll approve of how I'm handling it." "Good. Give him hell, little sister." Sarah smiled. She fully intended to. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for what would likely be her final anonymous visit to the medical center. Captain Rodriguez had provided her with a small recording device that looked like an ordinary fitness tracker, along with detailed instructions on its operation and legal disclaimers about its use. As Sarah dressed in her now familiar civilian clothes, she felt like she was putting on armor for battle. Except this time, her weapons weren't military strategy and logistics coordination. They were documentation, legal authority, and the accumulated weight of professional accountability. The drive to the medical center gave her time to review her plan. She would conduct the session exactly as she had the previous three, asking the same questions and observing the same interactions. But this time, everything would be recorded for potential use in the formal investigation. More importantly, this would be her last opportunity to gather evidence before revealing her true identity. Captain Rodriguez had made it clear that once Sarah's rank became known, the dynamics would change completely. Staff members would modify their behavior, either out of newfound respect or defensive caution. The waiting room held its usual collection of veterans in various stages of recovery. Sarah noticed Jess, the young Air Force veteran she'd overhead during her last visit, sitting near the window with an expression of resigned frustration. Apparently, she'd decided to continue her treatment here despite her friend's warnings. Derek's pattern of selective attention continued unchanged. He greeted obvious veterans with warmth and enthusiasm while treating others with professional indifference. When he called Jess's name, Sarah watched him guide her to the therapy area with the same mechanical detachment she'd experienced herself. "Chun," Derek called out 20 minutes later, his voice carrying its familiar note of disinterest. Sarah gathered her things and followed him to the now familiar desk area, mentally activating the recording device as she walked. Captain Rodriguez had emphasized the importance of capturing not just what was said, but how it was said. Tone, attitude, and body language were all relevant to understanding the full scope of the problem. "How's the pain level today?" Derek asked without looking up from his clipboard. "Actually, worse than last time," Sarah replied honestly. "The exercises you gave me seem to be aggravating the nerve damage rather than helping." Derek finally looked at her, but his expression was one of mild annoyance rather than concern. "Are you sure you're doing them correctly?" The question was delivered with a subtle edge that suggested Derek had already decided the problem was patient error rather than treatment inadequacy. Sarah had to consciously control her tone as she responded. "I've been following your instructions exactly. But I'm wondering if there might be alternative approaches for dealing with nerve complications." "Look," Derek said, setting down his pen with obvious impatience. "These are standard exercises for your type of injury. If you're not seeing improvement, maybe you need to consider that some limitations might be permanent." The casual dismissal of her concerns was breathtaking in its callousness. Derek was essentially telling her to accept reduced function without exploring other treatment options. Sarah wondered if he would offer the same hopeless prognosis to someone wearing a veteran's cap. Are there other therapists here who specialize in complex nerve damage? She pressed. Derek's irritation was becoming more obvious. We all have the same training. If you're not satisfied with your care here, maybe you should consider seeking treatment elsewhere. There it was. Rather than addressing her concerns or modifying the treatment plan, Derek was essentially telling her to leave. Sarah filed away his exact words, knowing they would be crucial evidence in the upcoming investigation. The remainder of the session proceeded with Derek's now familiar pattern of mechanical indifference. He guided her through exercises without explanation, showed no interest in her progress, and seemed eager to finish as quickly as possible. But then something happened that changed everything. As Derek was noting something on his clipboard, Sarah's sweater shifted slightly during a shoulder exercise, exposing just the edge of her snake tattoo. It was barely visible, just the curved tip of the serpent's tail, but Derek's eyes landed on it immediately. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The bored expression vanished, replaced by sharp attention. "Is that a tattoo?" he asked, his voice suddenly alert. Sarah glanced down at her shoulder, realizing what had happened. "Yes." "What is it?" Sarah could have deflected the question or given a vague answer. Instead, she decided this was the moment to begin revealing her true identity. "It's a snake," she said simply. "I got it after completing some specialized training." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about her answer seemed to trigger a recognition he couldn't quite place. "What kind of specialized training?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Military training." The change in Derek's expression was immediate and dramatic. The casual dismissiveness vanished, replaced by uncertainty and growing concern. "You're military?" "Yes." "Active duty?" Sarah paused, savoring the moment. "I'm on medical leave." Derek's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. He was clearly trying to reconcile the unremarkable woman he'd been treating with casual indifference with the possibility that she might be someone whose opinion could have serious consequences for his career. What's your rank?" he asked hesitantly. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, watching him squirm with the uncertainty of not knowing exactly how much trouble he might be in. "I think that's enough for today," she said, standing up and gathering her things. Derek scrambled to his feet as well, his professional composure completely shattered. "Wait, if I've done something wrong." "Derek," Sarah said quietly, "you've done everything wrong." She walked away, leaving him standing by the desk with his mouth open and his face flushed with panic. As she passed through the therapy area, she noticed that several other staff members had observed the interaction and were exchanging worried glances. At the scheduling desk, Rita looked up with her usual polite disinterest, apparently unaware of what had just transpired. "Same time next week?" Rita asked automatically. "No, sarà riplay. I don't think that will be necessary." Rita's hand paused over the appointment book. "Is everything okay?" Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. "Everything's about to be fine." As she walked toward the exit, Sarah could hear urgent whispered conversations breaking out behind her. Word was already spreading that something significant had just happened, though no one was quite sure what. She reached her car and sat for a moment, letting the adrenaline of confrontation settle. Her phone immediately rang. Captain Rodriguez. "Colonel, how did the session go?" "I think Derek is beginning to understand that he may have made some serious errors in judgment." "But you didn't reveal your rank?" "Not exactly, but he knows I'm military, and he's clearly terrified about what that might mean." Captain Rodriguez chuckled grimly. "Good. Fear might motivate some honest reflection. Did you get everything recorded?" "Every word." "Excellent. I'll expect your full report by end of business today." "And, Colonel?" "Yes. I think it's time to let them know exactly who they've been dismissing." The morning after Sarah's revelation to Derek, the Regional Military Medical Center buzzed with an undercurrent of nervous energy that hadn't been present during her previous visits. Word had clearly spread through the physical therapy department that something significant had occurred, though the details remained unclear to most of the staff. Sarah arrived at exactly 0800, but this time she wasn't dressed in anonymous civilian clothing. Instead, she wore her dress blue uniform, complete with the silver oak leaves that identified her rank and the ribbons that told the story of her distinguished service career. Her bearing was unmistakably military, shoulders back, spine straight, every movement reflecting the confidence and authority that came from years of command. Captain Rodriguez walked beside her, also in uniform, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the formal investigation documents. Major Williams followed a step behind, his expression serious as he prepared to witness what would likely be a career-defining moment for several people. The automatic doors opened, and Sarah stepped into the lobby with the measured pace of someone who owned every space they entered. The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as patients and staff alike turned to look at the obviously high-ranking officer who had just arrived. Jessica, at the reception desk, looked up from her computer, and her eyes widened as she took in Sarah's uniform and rank insignia. The casual indifference that had characterized their previous interactions vanished instantly, replaced by the kind of nervous attention typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Good morning, ma'am," Jessica stammered, immediately standing. "How can I help you today?" Sarah approached the desk with the same measured steps she'd used when arriving for her previous appointments. "I have an appointment with Derek Morrison in physical therapy." Jessica's fingers fumbled across her keyboard as she pulled up the schedule. "Yes, ma'am, I see. Wait." She stopped typing and looked up with confusion. Are you Sarah Chun?" "Lieutenant-colonel Sarah Chen," Sarah corrected gently. The blood drained from Jessica's face as the full implications hit her. This was the same woman she dismissed with casual indifference 4 times over the past month. The same patient she'd treated with the minimal courtesy she reserved for people she perceived as unimportant. "Ma'am, if there's been any misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," Sarah said calmly. "I'd like you to call Derek and let him know I'm here." Jessica reached for her phone with trembling fingers. "Of course, ma'am. Right away." As Jessica made the call, Sarah could hear her voice wavering as she spoke to someone in the therapy department. "Derek? There's a Lieutenant Colonel Chun here to see you." "Yes, that's Sarah Chun. She's in uniform." Even from across the lobby, Sarah could hear Derek's sharp intake of breath through the phone receiver. Within minutes, Derek appeared at the entrance to the therapy area, and the change in his appearance was dramatic. Gone was the casual confidence he displayed during their previous sessions. His face was pale, his hands were shaking slightly, and his professional composure had completely evaporated. Behind him stood Rita, Kevin, and several other therapy staff members who had clearly been summoned to witness whatever was about to unfold. Their expressions ranged from confusion to dawning horror as they began to understand the situation. Derek approached with the tentative steps of someone walking toward their own execution. "Colonel Kin, Mom, I had no idea." "No idea of what, Derek?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath the surface. Your rank, ma'am. Your position. If you had known my rank, you would have treated me differently." Derek opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as he realized the trap inherent in the question. Any answer he gave would be an admission of discriminatory treatment. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, her notebook open and pen ready. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Captain Rodriguez from the Inspector General's office. We're conducting a formal investigation into the quality of care provided at this facility." Derek's face went from pale to ashen. "An investigation? Colonel Chun has filed a formal complaint alleging discriminatory treatment based on perceived veteran status and appearance. We need to discuss your interactions with her over the past month." Rita, who had been standing behind Derek, suddenly stepped forward. "Excuse me, but there must be some mistake. We treat all our patients equally here." Sarah turned her attention to Rita, her expression unchanged. "Do you remember me, Rita?" Rita studied Sarah's face, clearly struggling to reconcile the commanding officer before her with the unremarkable woman she'd been scheduling appointments for. Yes, ma'am. I remember scheduling your appointments, but you don't remember treating me with the same courtesy you show other patients." "Ma'am, I don't understand what you mean. Captain Rodriguez consulted her notes. Rita, during Colonel Chin's previous visits, did you stand when she approached your desk? I well know, but did you address her with any level of respect or courtesy beyond the minimum required? Rita's confusion was genuine, but it only highlighted the unconscious nature of her discriminatory behavior. I was polite to everyone. Were you? Sarah asked quietly. Because I watched you interact with other patients, Rita. I saw how you stood up for the gentleman in the Marine Corps shirt. I heard the warmth in your voice when you spoke to the woman whose husband was wearing his veteran's cap. But when you looked at me, you saw someone who didn't matter enough to deserve that same level of respect. Rita's face flushed as the reality of her behavior began to sink in. Ma'am, I never meant. Intent is irrelevant, Captain Rodriguez interrupted. What matters is impact. And the impact of your behavior, along with Mr. Morrison's, has been to provide substandard care to a distinguished military officer based solely on her appearance. Derek, who had been standing in increasingly uncomfortable silence, finally found his voice. Colonel, if I had any idea who you were. Stop, Sarah said sharply. Don't finish that sentence, Derek, because it will only make things worse for you. Derek fell silent, but Sarah could see him struggling with a desire to defend himself. You want to tell me that if you had known my rank, you would have treated me with respect. You want to explain that your behavior was just a misunderstanding, that you're not actually the kind of person who provides different levels of care based on how patients look. Derek nodded eagerly, apparently thinking Sarah was offering him a way out. But that's exactly the problem, Sarah continued, her voice growing harder. You're telling me that respect and quality care are commodities you distribute based on rank and status rather than need and entitlement. The lobby had grown quiet as other patients and staff members paused their activities to listen. Sarah was aware that her voice had carried, but she didn't care. This conversation needed to be heard by everyone present. Derek, let me tell you about the young woman who was in your waiting room yesterday. Jess, I believe her name was. Air Force veteran, injured in service to her country, seeking the same kind of care I was. How did you treat her? Derek's silence was answer enough. How about the dozens of other veterans who don't look like your mental image of what a service member should be? The women who choose not to advertise their military background, the people who dress casually for their medical appointments, the ones who don't fit your narrow stereotype of veteran appearance. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward again. Mr. Morrison, as part of this investigation, we'll be reviewing your patient satisfaction scores, treatment outcomes, and scheduling patterns. We'll also be interviewing other patients about their experiences with your care. The implications were clear. If Derek had been providing differential treatment based on appearance, the evidence would be documented across multiple patients and data sources. Kevin, who had been standing silently behind Derek, suddenly spoke up. Ma'am, I want to say something. Sarah turned her attention to him. Kevin had been one of the therapists she'd observed providing excellent care to all his patients, regardless of their appearance. I've watched Derek work for months, Kevin said, his voice carrying a mixture of reluctance and determination. And I've noticed that his level of engagement varies significantly based on how military his patients look. Derek spun around to stare at Kevin in shock and betrayal. Kevin, what are you doing? I'm telling the truth, Kevin replied firmly. I've seen you spend extra time with patients wearing military gear while rushing through sessions with people who look like civilians. I've watched you offer encouragement and detailed explanations to some veterans while treating others like they're wasting your time. Captain Rodriguez was taking rapid notes. Mr. Thompson, Kevin Thompson. Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to provide a formal statement as part of our investigation? Yes, ma'am. I think it's important that everyone receives the same quality of care. Derek looked like he was about to be sick. Kevin, you don't understand. Understand perfectly, Kevin replied. I understand that Colonel Chun has been coming here for a month, dealing with complex injuries that deserve specialized attention. And instead of receiving the best care we can provide, she's been dismissed and minimized because she doesn't fit your idea of what a veteran looks like. Sarah watched the exchange with growing respect for Kevin's integrity. It took courage to speak up against a colleague, especially in such a public forum. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, "I observed your work during my visits here. You consistently provided excellent care to all your patients. That's the standard everyone should be held to." Kevin's face flushed with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "Thank you, ma'am. I just try to treat everyone the way I want to be treated if I was injured and seeking help." "That's exactly the right approach," Captain Rodriguez agreed. "And it highlights how far short others have fallen." Derek made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Colonel, please, I never meant any disrespect. If I could just have another chance." Sarah studied him for a long moment, considering her response. When she spoke, her voice was measured but unforgiving. "Derek, do you know what this tattoo represents?" She gestured toward her shoulder, where the edge of the snake design was visible beneath her uniform collar. Derek shook his head mutely. "It represents perseverance through impossible circumstances. It represents refusing to be broken no matter how much pressure is applied. It represents the kind of strength that allows someone to complete Ranger School as one of only a handful of women ever to do so." Derek's eyes widened as the significance of Ranger School penetrated his consciousness. Even civilians knew that Ranger School was one of the most demanding military training programs in existence. "You see, Derek, every time you dismissed my concerns, every time you rushed through my treatment, every time you treated me like I was wasting your time, you're disrespecting not just me, but everyone who wears this uniform. You were saying that respect and quality care are earned through appearance rather than service." Sarah paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "But the worst part isn't what you did to me. The worst part is what you've been doing to other veterans who don't have the rank and authority to demand better. How many people have left here feeling like their service didn't matter? How many have received inadequate treatment because they didn't look military enough for your standards?" Derek's face was now completely drained of color. The full scope of his behavior and its implications was finally becoming clear to him. Captain Rodriguez closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "Mr. Morrison, you'll be receiving formal notice of this investigation within 48 hours. I recommend you contact your union representative and legal counsel." Rita, who had been standing in horrified silence, suddenly burst into tears. "Colonel, I'm so sorry. I never realized. I never thought." "That's the problem, Rita," Sarah replied, not unkindly. "You never thought about how your behavior affected the people on the receiving end. But ignorance isn't an excuse for treating veterans poorly." As Sarah prepared to leave, she noticed that a crowd had gathered in the lobby. Patients and staff members alike had witnessed the confrontation, and she could see the mixture of shock, understanding, and approval on their faces. Jess, the young Air Force veteran, stood near the window with an expression of vindication and relief. She approached Sarah hesitantly. "Mom, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been trying to figure out why I felt so unwelcome here, and now I understand it wasn't in my head." "It wasn't in your head," Sarah confirmed, "and it wasn't acceptable. You deserve the same level of care as any other veteran." As Sarah walked toward the exit, followed by Captain Rodriguez and Major Williams, she could hear excited conversations breaking out behind her. Word of what had just transpired would spread quickly through the veteran community, and changes would have to be made. Derek remained standing by the therapy entrance, looking like a man whose world had just collapsed around him. Rita had returned to her desk, but was making no pretense of working, instead staring at her hands with obvious distress. Kevin approached Sarah before she reached the door. "Colonel, Mom, I just wanted you to know that not everyone here thinks the way Derek does. Some of us really do believe in treating all veterans with the respect they've earned." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "I know, Mr. Thompson, and I hope you'll be part of the solution as this facility improves its practices." As they walked toward their car, Major Williams spoke quietly. "That was impressive, ma'am. Controlled but devastating." Captain Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Derek Morrison's career in veteran healthcare is effectively over. After today, no medical facility will want the liability of employing someone with a documented pattern of discriminatory treatment. Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Derek's downfall would send a message, but real change would require systematic reform of attitudes and practices throughout the facility. "Captain, I want to make sure this investigation is thorough," Sarah said as they reached their vehicle. "I want interviews with other patients, review of treatment protocols, and assessment of staff training programs. This can't happen again." "Understood, Mom. I'll be submitting a preliminary report to the base commander by the end of the week." As they drove back to the base, Sarah found herself thinking about all the veterans who would receive better care because of what had just transpired. Derek's humiliation was unfortunate, but necessary. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system was to make the consequences of broken behavior too painful to ignore. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "How did the big reveal go?" Sarah typed back, "The snake has been awakened." "Good. Give them hell, Colonel." Sarah smiled. She already had. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the Regional Military Medical Center, Sarah sat in the base commander's office, reviewing the preliminary findings of Captain Rodriguez's investigation. The scope of what they'd uncovered was both broader and more damaging than she'd initially expected. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, set down the thick investigation report with visible frustration. 67 interviews, comprehensive data analysis, and the pattern is undeniable. "We're looking at systematic discriminatory treatment affecting an estimated 30% of veteran patients at that facility." Captain Rodriguez, seated across from Sarah, added grimly, "The most troubling finding is that this wasn't limited to Derek Morrison. We identified differential treatment patterns among multiple staff members, suggesting either conscious coordination or deeply embedded cultural bias." "What about patient outcomes?" Sarah asked. "Significantly worse for patients who didn't present obvious military appearance," Rodriguez replied, consulting her notes. "Longer treatment periods, higher dropout rates, and lower satisfaction scores across multiple metrics." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "This is going to require immediate action at multiple levels. The Medical Centers Administration, the Regional VA Oversight Board, and potentially congressional attention." Sarah had expected this conversation, but the magnitude of the required response was still sobering. What had begun as her personal experiment in anonymous care had revealed institutional problems that would take years to fully address. "Sir, I'd like to request permission to take lead on the remediation efforts," Sarah said. "This started with my investigation, and I want to see it through to proper resolution." Colonel Harrison studied her carefully. "Colonel, that would require you to take on a major additional responsibility while you're still recovering from your own injuries. Are you sure you want that burden?" "Respectfully, sir, this isn't a burden. It's a mission. We have veterans receiving substandard care because of unconscious bias and institutional indifference. That's unacceptable, and it's exactly the kind of problem the military should be equipped to solve." Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Colonel Chin's direct experience with the discriminatory treatment gives her unique credibility to lead reform efforts. Her testimony alone would carry significant weight with oversight boards. "Very well," Colonel Harrison agreed. "But I want comprehensive progress reports every 2 weeks, and I want to know immediately if you encounter resistance from the Civilian Medical Administration." Sarah felt a familiar surge of purpose that reminded her why she'd chosen a military career. This was exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that energized her, identifying broken processes, developing solutions, and implementing change through disciplined execution. The next phase of her mission would be more complex than simply documenting problems. Now she had to build bridges with civilian medical administrators who were likely defensive about the investigation's findings, while also ensuring that real reforms were implemented rather than cosmetic changes designed to weather the immediate scrutiny. Her first meeting with the Medical Centers Administration was scheduled for the following Monday. Dr. Margaret Foster, the the facility director, had requested a private conversation before the formal remediation planning session. Sarah suspected this would be an attempt to minimize the scope of required changes, but she was prepared to push back against any efforts to downplay the seriousness of what they discovered. Dr. Foster's office was impressive in its clinical sterility. White walls, metal furniture, and medical certifications arranged with mathematical precision. The woman herself was equally polished, with silver hair pulled back severely and a handshake that conveyed authority without warmth. "Colonel Chun, thank you for meeting with me," Dr. Foster began, gesturing toward a chair across from her massive desk. "I want to discuss the investigation findings before we involve a larger administrative team." Sarah settled into her chair, maintaining the alert posture that was second nature after years of military bearing. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this directly, Dr. Foster. I've reviewed Captain Rodriguez's report thoroughly, and while I'm concerned about the specific incidents involving Mr. Morrison, I want to ensure we maintain perspective about the overall quality of care provided here. There it was, the attempt to frame Derek's behavior as an isolated incident rather than symptomatic of broader institutional problems. Dr. Foster, with respect, the investigation identified discriminatory treatment patterns involving multiple staff members across several departments. This isn't about one individual's poor judgment." Dr. Foster's polished composure remained unchanged, but Sarah caught a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Colonel, I understand your concern, but we serve thousands of veterans annually with generally excellent outcomes. We can't allow a few unfortunate interactions to overshadow our overall mission. Doctor, 30% of veteran patients who don't present obvious military appearance receive substandard care at your facility. That's not a few unfortunate interactions. That's a systematic failure that affects hundreds of people annually. Those statistics may not account for other variables that could explain different treatment patterns." Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of command. "Dr. Foster, I was one of those statistics. I personally experienced the discriminatory treatment your staff provides to veterans who don't fit their narrow stereotypes. There are no confounding variables that excuse what I witnessed and experienced." For the first time, Dr. Foster's composure cracked slightly. The reality of confronting a high-ranking officer who had personally experienced the discrimination made it impossible to dismiss the findings as statistical anomalies. "Colonel, I want to assure you that we take these findings seriously and are committed to making necessary improvements." "Good. Then, you'll have no objection to implementing the comprehensive reforms outlined in our preliminary recommendations." Sarah slid a folder across the desk containing her initial reform proposal. She'd spent days developing detailed recommendations that addressed everything from staff training protocols to patient feedback mechanisms. Dr. Foster opened the folder and began reading, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "Colonel, some of these recommendations would require significant changes to our operational procedures." "Yes, they would, because significant changes are necessary to address significant problems. The mandatory bias training for all patient-facing staff, the revised patient feedback systems, the regular monitoring of treatment patterns by veteran status, these would require substantial time and financial investment." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the edge that her troops had learned to recognize as a warning. "Dr. Foster, let me make something very clear. The cost of implementing these reforms is insignificant compared to the cost of continuing to provide discriminatory care to veterans. I understand your position, but we have to be realistic about implementation timelines and resource constraints." "No, Doctor, we have to be realistic about the consequences of inaction. The Inspector General's investigation is just the beginning. If we don't see immediate, substantial improvements, this matter will escalate to congressional oversight, media attention, and potentially federal intervention." The threat was implicit but clear. Dr. Foster could either cooperate with military-led reform efforts or face much more aggressive external pressure. Dr. Foster closed the folder, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. Colonel, what exactly are you asking for? I'm asking for your full cooperation in implementing comprehensive reforms designed to ensure that every veteran receives the same high-quality care regardless of their appearance or presentation. I'm asking you to acknowledge that your current system has failed veterans and commit to meaningful change. And if we agree to these reforms, then we work together to make this facility a model for how veterans should be treated. We turn a source of shame into a source of pride. Dr. Foster was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she spoke with the resignation of someone accepting inevitable change. Colonel, I'll present your recommendations to our administrative board, but I need your assurance that you'll work with us rather than against us during the implementation process. Dr. Foster, I have no interest in destroying this facility or ending careers unnecessarily. My goal is ensuring that veterans receive the care they've earned through their service. If you share that goal, we'll work together very effectively. The meeting concluded with tentative agreement to move forward with planning sessions, but Sarah could tell that Dr. Foster remained resistant to the scope of changes being demanded. Resistance was expected. Institutional change was never easy, and medical administrators were particularly protective of their operational autonomy. As Sarah drove back to the base, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that first anonymous appointment with Derek. What had begun as a simple attempt to assess the quality of care had evolved into a comprehensive campaign to reform veteran healthcare practices. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Major Williams. Good afternoon, Colonel. How did the meeting with Dr. Foster go? About as expected, Major. Defensive posturing followed by reluctant cooperation. She'll present our recommendations to her board, but we should prepare for pushback on implementation timelines and resource allocation. Understood, Mom. I've been researching similar reform efforts at other facilities, and I have some additional leverage we might be able to apply if necessary. Sarah smiled. Major Williams had an exceptional talent for finding creative solutions to administrative obstacles. What kind of leverage? Federal funding, compliance requirements, accreditation standards, and congressional interest in veteran healthcare quality. If they resist our reform efforts, we can demonstrate that their current practices violate multiple oversight standards. Excellent work, Major. Prepare detailed briefings on all available pressure points. If cooperation doesn't work, we'll escalate through official channels. After ending the call, Sarah found herself thinking about Derek. According to Captain Rodriguez's latest update, he had been placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. His career in veteran healthcare was effectively over, regardless of the investigation's final conclusions. Sarah felt no sympathy for Derek's situation. His discriminatory behavior had real consequences for the veterans who depended on his care. But she did wonder if he'd learned anything from the experience, or if he would simply move on to another position where he could continue treating people poorly without accountability. The following weeks were consumed with planning sessions, negotiations with medical administrators, and the complex logistics of implementing systematic change across a large healthcare facility. Dr. Foster's administrative board had approved most of Sarah's recommendations, though they negotiated longer implementation timelines for some of the more complex reforms. The mandatory bias training had been the most contentious issue. Medical staff resented the implication that they needed education about treating patients fairly, but Sarah had insisted that awareness training was essential for preventing future discrimination. Kevin Thompson had emerged as an unexpected ally in the reform process. His willingness to speak out against Derek's behavior had earned him respect among both military leadership and facility administration. He'd volunteered to help develop new training protocols and patient feedback systems. Colonel, Kevin said during one of the planning meetings, I've been thinking about how to make these changes stick after the immediate attention dies down. Sarah looked up from the implementation timeline they'd been reviewing. What do you have in mind? We need to change the culture, not just the policies. That means recognizing and rewarding staff who provide excellent care to all veterans, regardless of appearance. It means making bias-free treatment a source of professional pride rather than just a compliance requirement. Sarah nodded approvingly. Kevin understood that lasting change required more than new rules. It required shifting underlying attitudes and incentives. That's an excellent insight. How do you suggest we implement that kind of cultural change? Regular recognition programs for staff who demonstrate exceptional care to all veteran populations. Patient feedback systems that specifically measure respect and dignity. And, most importantly, leadership that consistently models the behavior we want to see. Sarah made notes as Kevin spoke, impressed by his grasp of organizational change principles. Kevin, have you considered applying for leadership positions? You clearly have the insight and communication skills to drive positive change. Kevin's face flushed with surprise and pride. I hadn't really thought about it, ma'am. But if you think I can make a difference, I think you're already making a difference. The question is whether you want to expand your impact. As the conversation continued, Sarah reflected on how much progress they'd made in just a few weeks. The investigation had revealed serious problems, but it had also identified people like Kevin who were committed to providing excellent care regardless of patient appearance. 3 months after her confrontation with Derek, Sarah returned to the Regional Military Medical Center for her first appointment since revealing her identity. The changes were immediately apparent. New signage emphasizing respect for all veterans, staff wearing pins that read "Honor Through Service," and a completely restructured intake process that emphasized dignity and courtesy. Jessica, the receptionist who had initially dismissed her, approached with obvious nervousness. "Colonel Chun, ma'am, welcome back. I wanted to personally apologize for my previous behavior and assure you that we've implemented new protocols to ensure all veterans receive the respect they deserve." Sarah could see that Jessica's nervousness was genuine, but she could also see evidence of real change in how the young woman carried herself. The casual indifference was gone, replaced by professional attention that seemed to extend to all patients. "Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate your willingness to change and improve." Sarah's new therapist was Kevin Thompson, who had been promoted to senior therapist following Derek's departure and Rita's transfer to a different department. The session was everything physical therapy should be: professional, attentive, and focused entirely on her recovery needs. "How does the shoulder feel today, Colonel?" Kevin asked as they worked through a series of range of motion exercises. "Stronger than it has in months," Sarah replied honestly. "The new treatment approach is definitely more effective." "I'm glad to hear that. We've completely revised our protocols for complex nerve damage cases, incorporating some of the latest research on rehabilitation techniques." As they worked, Sarah noticed other changes throughout the facility. Staff members were clearly making efforts to engage with all patients equally, regardless of appearance. The differential treatment patterns she'd observed during her anonymous visits were no longer evident. But the most significant change was in the atmosphere. Where there had once been an undercurrent of casual discrimination, there was now a sense of purpose and professionalism that extended to every interaction she observed. "Kevin," Sarah said as they concluded the session, "I want you to know how impressed I am with the changes you and your colleagues have implemented. This feels like a completely different place." Kevin smiled with obvious pride. "It is a different place, Colonel, and I think it's the place we always should have been." As Sarah prepared to leave, Dr. Foster appeared in the therapy area, something that apparently never would have happened before the investigation. "Colonel Chun, I wanted to personally thank you for your patience during our transition period. I know the reform process has been challenging, but I believe we're now providing the level of care our veterans deserve." "Dr. Foster, I'm impressed with the progress your team has made. This is exactly the kind of change we hope to achieve. I have to admit, Colonel, I was resistant to many of your recommendations initially, but seeing the improvement in both patient outcomes and staff satisfaction has convinced me that these changes were necessary." Sarah shook Dr. Foster's hand, noting the genuine warmth that had replaced their initial adversarial dynamic. "Doctor, implementing change is never easy, but You and your team have demonstrated that it's possible to improve while maintaining excellence. As Sarah walked toward the exit, she passed Jess, the young Air Force veteran who had been receiving treatment during her anonymous visits. Jess was working with one of the newer therapists, and the interaction she observed was exactly what veteran care should look like: respectful, engaged, and focused on optimal outcomes. Jess caught sight of Sarah and approached with a smile. "Colonel, I just wanted to thank you again for what you did. The difference in how I'm treated here now is incredible. How is your recovery progressing?" "Much better, ma'am. The new therapist actually listens to my concerns and adjusts the treatment plan based on my progress. I'm finally starting to feel like myself again." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction.